Special Operations Training Detachment, SOD West, Burrow Team. Coming at you from NTC, Off the Radar.
This is Off the Radar. I'm Captain Weston Rich, an observer coach trainer for the Green Berets at the National Training Center. Doctrine is the framework of everything we do in the Army. It's how we learn how to be soldiers and what our specific job entails. Doctrine directs us on what to execute and lays out the principles of how to accomplish what we do. Does Doctrine keep up with the current fight? How do we update Doctrine? How do we incorporate ground truth lessons learned? With us today to discuss these questions and more is Major Samantha Pavolko. Major Pavolko is the current Civil Affairs Proponent Doctrine Branch Chief and the first guest that we've had from the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and Schools. Thank you for coming and sharing your insights, Sam. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in the Special Operations community, the Army, anything else you'd like to share from your experience prior to Civil Affairs up until this point in your career.
Sure. Yeah. I started in the Army as a logistics officer. And then, in 2013, I went to a Civil Affairs qualification course and went to my first duty station in Fort Bliss, Texas, and deployed to Europe, where at the time in 2014, 2015, right, Crimea was happening at the time. So we got to see that up close from the 4th Infantry Division JOC, right, and try to reassure some European allies through NATO exercises.
Yeah.
And then I went from there to the Special Operations portion of Civil Affairs, right? So the 80th Civil Affairs Battalion, where I was stationed in Fort Bliss, was part of the 85th Civil Affairs Brigade, which is no longer in existence. So I got to see something that supported conventional forces, right? It was active duty Civil Affairs supporting conventional forces, but that no longer exists, right? So then I transferred over to Special Operations and was the Charlie Company 96 Civil Affairs Battalion CMOC Chief, where I went to Qatar and managed 5 teams across SOC CA. And then I was the HHC, the headquarters company commander for 96 Civil Affairs Battalion. Spent some time in 91st Civil Affairs Battalion, which is the AFRICOM-aligned battalion as well. I did company command there and executive officer time there. So lots of different
AORs,
yeah,
and
yep,
conventional side and Special Operations side, although you said now that the whole conventional Civil Affairs part belongs to the reserve.
Correct.
For U.S. Army CA PSYOP Command in the Army Reserves. Okay, I had no idea. Very diverse background. That's pretty cool. So give us a little rundown on your current role as the Doctrine
Sure,
Chief.
yeah. So this is my favorite job by far. And honestly, it's because you get to kind of sit back and think big thoughts about your branch and hopefully leave a good mark on it and preserve it for the future and make it better. So as the Doctrine Chief, I am looking at FM 357 and all of its subordinate Army techniques publications that describe the core competencies of civil affairs and make sure that they're relevant to the force and that that they are clear and that they describe something that the force actually does, right? They provide a capability that the Army actually needs. So that's why we come to these places like National Training Center to make sure that the force understands the doctrine and that the rest of the Army understands how to use civil affairs.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome overview.
Yeah.
So before we dive into making sure that the force understands doctrine and what's expected of them and how to operate outside when you're actually doing training and operations, how long does it take a new tactic, technique, or procedure, or just a new thing to get added to doctrine? Because I've heard it's like a 5-year turnaround.
So by regulation, so TRADOC regulations tell us that we have to update doctrine every 5 years, right? So you look at a publication once every 5 years to make sure that it doesn't need any significant revisions, right? If it's still okay, then we kind of just update the date of the publication. But generally speaking, stuff changes, pretty often. So that's kind of the cycle that we work in. It takes about 21 months for a publication to go from, inside someone's brain, right, a new idea to published and in the Army Publishing Directorate's website so that people can actually access it. That's 21 months.
Okay, what's just a really fast, because I think it's the civil affairs team that participated as the opposing force during this rotation. I heard they're interested in writing down their experience and codifying that. So if they have a nugget of information, how did they go about the process of potentially getting that in front of someone like you or your the next person that takes over your job and maybe getting that into doctrine?
I think this is why, I make a point to interact a lot with the operational force so that they know who I am and they have my email address and they can reach out to me with these kinds of lessons learned. But also we're asking for AARs from these exercises whenever we find out that they're happening from the S37 in both the 95th and then the USAJFKSWC units, the Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command Reserve units. So we take those AARs and those white papers and try to work them into the doctrine as it currently exists. One of the issues that people get really frustrated with doctrine is there's this hierarchy, right? There's the JPs, right? The joint publications, the Army doctrinal publications, the field manuals, the Army techniques publications, right? And so we have to fit all of our doctrine in that hierarchy, right? So I can't just put that lasers on sharks is a really good idea, right, into doctrine.
I get the reference.
Because, one, that's not something the Army is going to fit into its Army operating concept described in FM30. And it's not a capability that Civil Affairs purports to have, which is in Field Manual 3-57, right? So it has to fit within those things into some capacity. If it's a concept, right, if it's a new thing that we think should exist in the force that doesn't exist yet, it has to go through an experimentation process, which takes some time, right? You need at least three instances of experimentation, right, where it's a successful experiment for it to be validated as a concept. So, if it's something brand new, you're going to have to talk with USAJFKSWC, right, with the force modernization crew, and have them put it through an experimentation, campaign of learning to make sure it's a valid concept. If we don't do that, what sometimes happens is, someone's really good idea that really wasn't that well fleshed out gets put into doctrine, and then people don't understand it, don't know how to use it.
Where's that knowledge repository of whether something's new or not when it comes to a tactic, technique, or procedure? Is it at the force modernization in USAJFKSWC or is it somewhere else?
I think it would be at the proponent director or the branch commandant, right? Depending on the branch, right? Our branch commandant in special operations is General Jason Slider, right? Before him, General Beaupere, right? So the commandant of Special Operations Center of Excellence understands what's in the doctrine currently and what's coming from USASOC force modernization to become a doctrinal concept in the future. Now that's like a high level person to be contacting with your concepts, but each of the branches,
no, they're on global. Just reach out.
Let's just reach out to him, you know. But each of the branches has its proponent director, right? That's a lieutenant colonel. That's a much more accessible person. And then worst case, people have my email address.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's dive into the National Training Center. I think you kind of touched on this. You came out here to observe and see what the actual operational force is doing. So is that the biggest reason you came to NTC? Is there anything else that you got from observing a rotation?
Oh, I mean, we got so much from observing the rotation. Yeah, we were super excited to come out here and actually super impressed with what we found, because a lot of the feedback that you get from the operational forces, the scenario is not deep enough, right? There's not enough for me to do as a civil affairs soldier, because quite a bit of a scenario, is necessary for a civil affairs soldier to get value, right? It has to be deep. It has to have a lot of personalities. It has to connect, right? And so people get frustrated with that. And I think you guys have put a lot of work into making it a really deep and coherent and cohesive scenario with a lot of people to kind of flesh out for civil affairs soldiers, which is important because it's all about the civil networks for us, right? It's all about the people that we meet and their capabilities that we can leverage for military operations.
Yeah,
so
got to have that human dimension. And
sure.
And that takes a robust amount of role players, which here at National Training Center and at Joint Readiness Training Center, like, we do provide, and in many capacities, they're not just being out there as the host nation or partner fighting force. They are other partners, other organizations. They're all sorts of things. They're playing roles of U.S. State Department or foreign equivalent to State Department. So it's a diverse environment for the civil affairs to actually get out there and do key leader engagements and be in that human environment.
Yeah. One of the main things that we really wanted to observe was the interaction between special operations, civil affairs, and their conventional counterparts, right? And the reason why we chose this rotation is because both units were playing, right? We have the Bravo 92nd and Delta Company 450th in this exercise together, and we wanted to see how they interact, right? What their level of communication is, and how they're able to utilize that connection between them to kind of help the BCT consolidate gains, right?
Do reservist CA use the same doctrine as
absolutely,
CA?
Yeah. We're the whole branch, we're the whole force.
Everything.
Yep. Which, it is definitely unique, right? That we have this, two sides of the same branch. But what I like to say is that they're comprehensive capabilities, even if they're not exactly alike, right? Reserve civil affairs has a lot of capability that soft civil affairs doesn't have, right? They have 38 Gulfs, which is this very unique analysis capability across government functions, right? They have specialties in a specific government function. Soft can utilize that, right, to their advantage if they know it exists and they know how to use it. So we were happy to see both in this exercise, and really pleased with the amount of coordination that they did with each other. One of the main kind of doctrinal concepts that we we see as our value to large-scale combat operations is the ability to leverage these civil networks that exist, even if large-scale combat operations are going on, right? We can use them to preserve combat power. We can use them to sense the environment. We can do all of these things with them. But we need to make sure that, the BCT has knowledge of them. So that means they got to make it all the way from forward positions, right? Deep or, pretty far forward in the operational framework where SOF is operating. And they need to make it all the way to the BCT close or rear so they can actually be used for operations and for providing them a capability. So we saw that happen during this exercise, which is kind of unique. It's probably the first time I've ever seen that between SOF and Reserve Civil Affairs.
So what was like the good practice you saw these guys and girls in SOF CA and conventional CA? Mm-hmm. How were they cross-talking? Were they going to meet each other in person? What were they doing?
As you can imagine, in large-scale combat operations, they're not meeting over coffee, right, in the nearest cafe. One is very far forward in the operational framework, and one is in the BCT rear with the rear command post. Yeah. So they're not going to physically ever be co-located unless we've secured the entire area and we can all kind of walk about freely. So it took a lot of trial and error for the SOF and conventional civil affairs counterparts to figure out how they could communicate with each other. And part of the way that they were able to be successful was through the SOF LNO that sat in that AOB LNO to the BCT was able to help them communicate via classified information. And then if they needed to just reach out to the SOF civil affairs teams, they used box phones, right? Or what would be the equivalent of a local burner phone, or a nipper email, right? Okay. So it started with, hey, I need to tell you about something on either a nipper email or a box phone. And then it went over to Chat Surfer, which the AOB LNO had access to and could help them facilitate that contact.
No, so that's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know what the LNO package for this was made up of. For this particular rotation, usually it's like some 18 series SF guys and maybe some other enablers that are like soft skill, a logistics guy or a combo guy or something like that. Typically, they're not putting civil affairs into the LNO package. So it's good that LNO was cared enough to assist in bridging that gap and getting the conventional side talking to the soft side. It's not something that everybody does, but it's definitely a worthwhile practice to those people are sitting at the conventional unit and they are the representation of all RSOF tribes and all the things that Army Special Operations Forces are trying to do. So they might only have a background in one of the particular tribes, but they need to care about all of them and help champion that AOB staff to the conventional force.
Super well said. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I once was a SOF LNO at a CTC rotation, so that was before I got to be a detachment commander, which made it extra hard because I'm like, yeah, I just got out of the Q course and I don't really know exactly what detachments do, but sure, I'll be the LNO. Luckily, I had a pretty squared away Sergeant First Class help me out, and just through the qualification course, you learn how to talk to people and make connections and all the wonderful things that RSOF individuals get trained on. Mm-hmm. So awesome that conventional and SOF CA integrated and kind of understood each other, and sounds like they knocked it out of the park and have done a really well job. How did, from your perspective, SOF CA integrate with PSYOP and Special Forces and really get into that AOB staff and help the commander make decisions and shape the battlefield?
Yeah, I mean, I think a product of, being out in the deep, in the dirt, honestly, meant that they had to work together, right? And so every time we would go out there, they would be talking about how they were all pulling shifts, right, to make sure that they could maintain 24-hour operations with a really small AOB. Mm-hmm. But also, every single time we talked to the civil military operations chief, who was at the AOB, he talked about the kind of conversations that they were having as a group, right? So like the AOB commander was coming to him and asking him what his capabilities were. And he had to do some explaining, of course, at the beginning, right? Like, this is how you can utilize me best. It's going to take a little bit of time to develop this civil network, but once we can establish it, we can use it for things. And so I think by starting with the capabilities brief, right? That's kind of like the cliche. Like,
no, it's
we
not
just
a cliche.
need
It's
to tell people what you do. Yeah.
On here, like talk to civil affairs and psyops and a couple other guests that we've had, and it's always like, whatever your skill set is, that person, typically it's an AOB SF commander, has a background in special forces and then maybe one other thing, and they're not going to understand, so you better show up. And even if you're attached to a civil affairs team as some other MOS, like, you better show up and tell the leadership of that civil affairs team like how best to employ you, or they're just going to choose how they employ you.
Correct. Yeah, so you have to kind of educate them and nudge them along and say, hey, this is how my capabilities support your goals in this operation. And so once they kind of established what the value, right, was for these civil networks and for the understanding of what was going on, right, in these population centers, I think they were able to utilize them well. So they also had the ability to work closely with the rest of the staff, right, primarily the 18 FOCs, to make sure that we know exactly what the AOB commander needs in terms of information to be able to prosecute targets, right, and to be able to help the BCT move the plot forward, right?
Definitely.
So,
switching gears a little bit, like, we at the National Training Center in Special Operations Training Detachment, also at JRTC, our scenarios are large-scale combat operations, so we tend to focus like pretty exclusively on how do we get after multi-domain within large-scale combat. Is that something at your level, within your office, within your shop? Like, are you guys focused on that? Are you focused on some other portion of Doctrine? I mean, you've mentioned FM30 that came out not too long ago, which is all multi-domain stuff. So, like, are those typical conversations that within your shop you guys are having?
Absolutely. I think the whole Army is having that conversation, but specifically at the Centers of Excellence, every doctrine writer, every training developer is trying to figure out how we do multi-domain operations, how we survive and win in large-scale combat operations, right? Yeah. So, like, I have these conversations every day about LSCO.
So you're going to have a well-rehearsed Doctrine answer of how CA fits into large-scale combat operations.
Sure.
No, you can just give us the layman's terms. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, all of Army Special Operations forces focus on the deep, right? Because they have the early presence, right? So typically, we're conducting operations in SOF during competition, right? We're building long-term partnerships with our partners that we're training with. We're building these civil networks with, civilian entities on the ground over the course of years. The value of that long-term relationship can carry over to large-scale combat operations, right? So once we get into a a point in time where we know that we're going to be in conflict, potentially there's already a SOF team there. If there's not already a SOF team there, then there is information about that place from past SOF operations that we can hopefully glean some understanding of the operational environment from, so that, the Joint Force and the Army can plan their operations based on some good information. And then also, if there is a SOF unit, right, in this case, SOF Civil Affairs can help to set the theater, right? So that is facilitating reception, staging, and onward movement and integration, RSO and I remember that acronym.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're able to help open up a theater by giving the Joint Force visibility on the assets that are available to, logistically bring forces to that particular location, whether it be like port infrastructure or logistics lines into the actual area of operations. That's something that SOF Civil Affairs can help with. Okay. But then once we get into actual conflict and we are in the operational framework, right, and there's a deep where we're firing artillery into, there's a close where infantry and armor are combining arms and conducting maneuver, and there's a rear. Generally speaking, our SOF and SOF Civil Affairs as a proponent of RSOF are focused in the deep, right? Mm-hmm. And the potential exists that they may not be able to be physically present in the deep, right? Because either they weren't there to begin with, right, and it's too large of a risk to put them back in, or they could potentially be physically present, right, in those places. That's what, special operations training provides us the ability to mitigate the risk associated with being in a deep or a denied area. Not saying that that's the likely scenario, but it is possible for us to support those kinds of operations. But the more likely scenario, I think, is that we're operating from what we will call the strategic flank, right?
Okay.
Or a third country adjacent to the operational framework, in which we can affect that close and deep, and create multiple dilemmas for the enemy through our civil networks that we have connections with, right?
Yeah.
Who potentially have access to those places that we don't necessarily have access to. So that's how we can support in large-scale combat operations. It's through creating multiple dilemmas for the enemy in those deep areas through our civil networks. And then also providing a capability that can then consolidate gains, right? Once the FWAT moves down the line, right, those people that we have connections to who were once in the government or, are local power brokers in the society can help us rebuild what was destroyed during the course of combat. So that's where the transfer that I talked about between SOF and conventional civil affairs becomes really critical, because those networks were once the government and should be the government again, depending on the partner.
Specialist that exists in the reservist side.
Yeah.
Like SOF CA has a role throughout, however, and needs to understand it, because you're going to be focused on the deep, like you talked about, before the conventional civil affairs is focused on that area. So you are going to have to get to the point where you understand how to consolidate gains and start that transition process. And through that campaign plan, or whatever you want to call it, at some point, SOF turns that responsibility over to the conventional force, like holistically, but in this conversation, civil affairs. So reservists from civil affairs, PSYOP command, are going to be the ones that are finishing out that transition piece and overseeing it. Because just in a very basic way, SOF is not there to hold ground. And that's what transition is in a sense. So like Special Forces isn't going to go take terrain. Infantry is going to take the terrain and hold it. SOF CA isn't going to hold on and build the governance piece. They will start it. They can start it. They don't necessarily have to, but they can begin that transition process, but they will pass that over to the reserve component.
You should take my job next. No. Yeah.
Believe it or not, one conversation with a CA captain. No, I'm just kidding. I got a bunch of wonderful civil affairs NCOs and officers that I've spent the last year plus talking with. So you can thank them. They are champions of your branch.
That's great.
Bringing it back to the National Training Center and your time observing this rotation, like what are things you're going to take away and bring back with you? And then, we'll just leave it at that. What are you going to take away from the rotation?
Mm-hmm. So we haven't finalized the trip report yet, right? So admittedly, this is a bit, jumbled in terms of thoughts. But I think one of the things that was really hammered home for me during this observation was that we have to really speed up the civil information that we're providing, right? Both in the collection of it and in the processing of it, right? Generally speaking, over the last 20 years of GWAT, right, we've had a lot of civil affairs teams doing things independently, right, in a country by themselves. They produce a report about, a significant thing or an engagement they had with an important person. It takes them 2 days to write the report. The CMOC, right, the operations center, who's in another country, takes 2 days to look at it, right? That's way too slow for us to be value added in large scale combat operations. So how do we speed up this cycle of collection and processing and analysis to support the objectives of the commander? And so I think, we have to just scale down what we are asking for. One, right? You're only going to get a guy's name, his phone number, right? And potentially his capabilities in terms of, how he can support a network or a military operation in the future. You're not going to get much else beside that whenever you're moving quickly through this operational framework. And so CA folks need to be comfortable with that, and they need to figure out how they quickly transmit that information. That's something that, we as the branch need to help them out with, right? They don't need to make that solution themselves, but it's something that we're thinking about a lot, is speeding up that process of civil knowledge integration to help the commander. And then another thing I think would be, in the same vein of, operating on the move in large-scale combat operations, we need to provide some easy ways to classify information so that you can put it on a sand table, you can put it on acetate, right? Because you're not going to build this very detailed, sexy product, right? When you're out in the middle of nowhere in a JLTV or in a military vehicle or in a very austere environment. So you're going to have to tailor, right, what your products actually look like. And part of that is, we as the Doctrine folks need to investigate whether we have the right symbols, right? Just really basic stuff like that. Okay. When I'm talking about a civil network and their capabilities to the commander, I don't really have a symbol for that.
Yeah, to put on a overlay.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's just some really basic stuff that we're thinking about to be helpful. And then I also think we should be clarifying the relationship and what it looks like between SOF and conventional, right? And that transition, which we saw in practice here. And I really I learned a lot from this rotation. So
well, that's awesome. I don't know, not being civil affairs myself, if that's something we always get to in the rotation. I know that in the upcoming division level rotation, that's something that we are striving towards, really focusing on getting we're kind of looking at 2 rotations on the SOF side as like the whole scenario is continuous throughout, and at the tail end of the second one, there's going to be a transition piece, and the SOF CA is going to have to do a lot of that. And if we can get key players like the division commander or his deputy or somebody like that to go participate in the transition, that's great. But yeah, I digress. I don't know if that happens all the time, but it's something that probably should, because that integration piece is like one of the main things you come to a combat training center for, because you have people that are from different home stations and they all show up here to train together. And you're like, I wish that we had been training together before we got here. Well, that was something that would have been great to know 6 months ago. But you're here now and you got to figure it out. And a lot of good value comes in a very short period of time when you're like in the dirt and have to do it. With the symbol piece, before I forget, we talk about common operating picture a lot, in a very like typical way with the intelligence portion, but we've also discussed it through civil common operating picture. So like symbology would be of value. Like, how are they showing that? And then how are they analyzing it? And then being able to package that to a commander, whether that's a civil, or whether that's a conventional but commander or a RSOF commander.
Yep.
And so I think that's important.
Yeah. So we'll be publishing hopefully here in the next couple of months, ATP 3-57.50, which is civil knowledge integration, which will speak directly to that. And we've already got some updates that we need to do that based on this rotation. So
Right. Well, we will get, once that comes out, we'll get that into our Sergeant Major's hands, because he likes to read Doctrine when he's up at night. But I really thank you for your time. This has been a great conversation. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff, so much so I'm struggling to remember it all. But basically, your role, how something in very general terms becomes Doctrine, lessons learned through this rotation from your perspective, and then what you're going to take away. And then, as always, we talked a little bit about like, how does your specific tribe, civil affairs, fall into the large scale combat. I will let you close out and say anything that you'd like to share with the audience.
No, I mean, we had a great time here at National Training Center. It is by far one of the best training opportunities that I have seen, right? I didn't actually participate as a training unit, but I saw that there was a lot of thought put into it, and the dedication of the people putting it on was pretty apparent to me. And they all know their Doctrine, so kudos to all of you. I appreciate having me.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Off the Radar, where RSOF prepares for conflict. Like, subscribe, and share on your listening platform. Actions will determine the outcome.